Hi guys, Matt Easton here for Schola Gladiatoria. Here I am looking at British military antique swords, and we are specifically looking in this video at the 1899 pattern Cavalry Trooper's sword. So that was the standard new model of Cavalry Trooper's sword in the British Army from 1899. In actual fact, the sword, although it was introduced in 1899, not all regiments, and particularly yeomanry cavalry regiments, didn't receive it in some cases at all, and in other cases they didn't receive it until well after 1900. But I'll look into that in a minute. Let's just look at some stats. So what we have is a steel scabbard, and there's the sword. You can see this example is in very good condition. This example also is actually dated from 1900 and again restamped in 1901. The basic, if I just put the scabbard down for a second, the basic stats of the sword are: total weight is 2 3/4 pounds, which is around 1250 grams, 1250 grams. The blade length is 33.5 inches. The point of balance is at 5 inches from the crossguard. Now, the first things that you'll probably notice about this sword is that in comparison to other British models of sword, it's got a particularly large and unperforated steel guard to protect the hand. It's a very large guard. It looks very large compared to other swords. We'll look at some other swords in a second. And the grip is particularly long, and this is the main thing to actually comment on about this sword, is that this long grip actually came under some criticism during the period that it was in use, from 1899 till officially until 1908, although it stayed in use for a bit longer than that, because the criticism was that troopers' swords would slip down the grip in use. Now, in actual fact, in defence of this sword, I will say that I think there is a specific reason for the length of that grip, and it is that you are intended to actually grip at the bottom of it there, with your thumb placed up the back. The standard charged swords in the British cavalry at this time was in this position, with the thumb extended along the back. You always extend the thumb along the back when you're giving point, that is using the point or thrusting. And even in cutting, you should apply it quite a lot of the time. There were different ideas, different people said different things at the time about whether you should have the thumb up when you cut or not, but certainly some of them have the thumb up all the time. Others of them switch to what we call a hammer grip. However, the sword itself should be gripped pretty much near the bottom, which negates both of the criticisms really about the length of this grip. Firstly, it means that your hand's not going to slip down the grip because it should already be starting at the bottom. But equally, one of the criticisms was that the blade was a little too short at 33.5 inches. A lot of cavalry men, cavalry officers and troopers preferred blades of 34.5 or 35.5 inches, so more reach, which is better for, of course, fighting people who are on foot. In the Sudan, for example, a lot of the enemies actually lied down flat as the cavalry went past because they knew that they couldn't be reached by the cavalry swords then. However, although the blade is 33.5 inches long, if you hold the sword closer to the back, closer to the pommel, then of course you gain length. You essentially add sort of 2 or 3 inches to the reach of your blade. The disadvantage of doing this, of course, is it means that the point of balance, which is already 5 inches away from the guard, now becomes about 7 inches away from your hand, which is a similar point of balance to a cutting sword like a 1796 light cavalry sabre. So for a sword that at the time was predominantly used for giving point, for thrusting, that's kind of a point of balance which goes very far in front of the hand, which I suspect is the main reason why a lot of troopers wanted to get their hand closer to the point of balance, because it feels more controllable then, and so they put their hand right up at the top of the weapon and therefore have the problem of the hand slipping down. The sword, I think, generally speaking, was not well liked in the British military. However, as I've kind of started to hint at there, I don't think it was as bad a sword as has sometimes been made out in modern reference books written about swords. It did have a slightly longer life than some people assume. There are photographs of these in World War I being carried by yeomanry cavalry regiments, so they were still in use in 1914, despite the fact that in 1908 a new pattern of sword had come in. Just to say something about the evolution of this sword, so this was ultimately descended from the line of swords that have a Maltese cross perforation in the front of the guard that start in 1864. If I just lift up an 1864 pattern here we have an 1864 pattern, and you can see that the main difference is that the grip, the handle, is much longer. Okay. However, the basic guard shape is similar. Obviously the guard gets bigger to fit the longer grip. And in 1885 this little piece here was inserted to prevent the fingers getting jammed in that crook there. Okay, so it makes it a bit more comfortable to grip, essentially, if the hand slides to the pommel end. Also the pommel is slightly larger on the 1899 to assist with that, with the point of balance. And in fact this is a shorter blade than the 1864. The 1864 had a 35.5 inch blade, so this is 2 inches shorter in the blade, but as you can see it's about an inch longer in the hilt. That 1864 pattern was updated pretty much continuously from 1880 onwards. In 1880 it was updated a bit. There were actually two models then. There was a long and a short model. In 1882 again it was revised, 1885 it was revised, 1890 it was revised. So by the time that the 1899 pattern came along, I think there was a feeling in the British military that it was about time for a completely new model of sword. So they did make these from scratch, whereas the previous, the 1880, 1882, 1885 and 1890, many of them had been modifications of swords that were already in service. The 1899 was a completely fresh start. However, as we've just seen, it did retain a lot of the same design features. The patent tang or patent hilt is worth mentioning. It is a full width tang, so that grip that you can see there, the tang is actually the full width of that. If I just move that close to the camera you can hopefully see that. That is the tang there. And this has 3 rivets through instead of the 5 rivets of the earlier 1864 to 1890 patterns, but they're larger, thicker rivets. And the same type of checkered leather grip. In fact, some of these are some kind of composition rather than leather, but they are essentially 2 slabs, much like a kitchen knife, that are riveted through and bolted on each side of the tang. So there we go, this is the sword that was used at the time of the Boer War, although I should mention the earlier 1885 and 1890 patterns, which are essentially the same sword, were still in service at the time of the Boer War. Not all regiments received this 1899 pattern, and for that reason the 1899 pattern is relatively rare today, because they weren't made in such large numbers as the earlier patterns and indeed the later patterns were. So there we go. I think it's had quite a hard press in books about swords and the history of British military swords. I don't think it's a terrible sword. However, it's very much clear that, much like other British swords of the late 19th century, it can't quite decide what it wants to be good at. It wants to be both a cut and thrust sword, but it's got a strange point of balance for a thrusting sword. It's got the wrong type of hilt or hilt length and proportions for a good cutting sword. It's just trying to be too many things and trying to tick too many boxes and not doing any of them particularly well. Having said that, it was by this point a moderately reasonable design. I've owned 2 of these in my life. I've swung them around quite a lot and practiced fencing movements with them, and they're not awful. They're okay. I wouldn't think it was a disaster if I had to fight with one. They're okay swords. I personally prefer the earlier patterns, the 1885 and 1890, as cavalry swords. I think they're better cavalry swords. They have a shorter hilt, which means they move better in the hand. They've got a better point of balance relative to where I would hold it on the hilt. And equally, they've got longer blades, and I think a longer blade, I think this is really at 33.5 inches, I think it's a bit on the short side for a cavalry sword. So there we go. And last thing to say is this was replaced in 1908 officially by the completely thrust-centric 1908 pattern, and we will look at this in a separate video. Thank you.